This hasn't been getting a lot of coverage, and the coverage that it has been getting hasn't been very good. So let's talk about the.
There are dozens of TikTok videos just like this one providing high quality analysis of the Ohio train derailment. I'm a historian of mass media, and I'm fascinated in the ways in which this TikTok coverage is actually superior to the reporting by traditional news outlets, which often just gullibly regurgitate the official government line or the company press releases. In the early days, it was stories like this, just repeating government officials patting themselves on the back so hard about their controlled burn that they almost threw their shoulders out. But as more news has trickled out, it's become obvious that skeptical TikTokers and other grassroots citizen journalists were right to be suspicious. But there's something even bigger here than the story of a train derailment in Ohio. This is the future of what I call the new news media. Think for a second what it is that traditional news outlets do, newspapers, local TV stations. They're informational middlemen. You, the consumer, you want the latest information about what's happened, but the problem is that knowledge of the event and what it means is widely distributed and thus inaccessible to you. And so traditional journalists would go out, try to interview locals and stakeholders, assess what happened and what it means, and then report back to us, the consumer. And that worked pretty well for a while, but it had its downsides. You see, when journalists parachute into a particular story or community, the easiest thing for them to get their bearings is to go to an official press conference where they absorb the government or corporate line, which is then always assumed to be a kind of baseline truth from which the rest of the story is developed. But it's not always sinister. Sometimes journalists just miss stories. They can't interview everyone, and they're on a deadline. But the rise of new platforms like TikTok means that the need for informational intermediaries has lessened. That knowledge and experience that's distributed can now bubble up organically via the platform. Rather than needing journalists to go out and hunt down expertise, now that knowledge is bubbling up algorithmically, like the video I stitched. These non-traditional, non-professional, let's call them citizen journalists, just happen to know an area or a subject matter. Like the creator of this video, who's from Pittsburgh, nearby the train derailment, and who happens to have a hobby of reading industrial accident reports. These citizen journalists aren't prone to gullibly trusting the government or corporate line. They're not under pressure for deadlines or to shareholders. The Ohio train derailment story is an example of how these new news media platforms like TikTok, Substack, and YouTube are not merely adequate substitutes for local news reporting, but how they can actually be superior alternatives.